Good morning, everyone. We welcome you to our Sunday morning roundtable discussion. This morning is Sunday, August 26, 2018. So happy to have you all here. And Florence will start this morning with our morning prayer. Thank you.
By Mrs. Eddy from her article, Christian Science Healing, on page 220 of Miscellany. Each day I pray for the pacification of all national difficulties, for the brotherhood of man, for the end of idolatry and infidelity, and for the growth and establishment of Christian religion, Christ, Christianity. I also have faith that my prayer availeth, and that he who is overturning will overturn until he whose right it is shall reign. Each day I pray, God, bless my enemies, make them thy friends, give them to know the joy and the peace of love.
Thank you. And for miscellaneous writings, we today in this classroom are enough to convert the world if we are of one mind, for then the whole world will feel the influence of this mind, as when the earth was without form, and mind spake, and form appeared. One thing before we get started, we want to remind you all our Bible study is starting not next Saturday, but the following September 8th. And we do need volunteers to moderate. Those of you who are feeling inspired, let's have you give us some inspired questions.
So contact Linda or Tom to sign up.
Or Jeremy.
Or Jeremy to sign up.
The directions are on the website.
And it's quite rewarding to do.
Yes. The subject today is Christ Jesus. The golden text is Revelation 1. Jesus Christ, who is the faithful witness, hath made us king and priest unto God and his Father. To him be glory and dominion forever and ever. I'm going to start today, before we get into the lesson. I believe this does relate to the lesson. When I was cleaning out my cabinets the other day, I came upon this article, I guess you would call an article, and it is called The 1910 Coup, C-O-U-P. It's been out for a long time. It was out in the 70s. I believe Reg Carey had it in his letters. We're not sure who wrote it. Jeremy thinks it might have been Myrtle Stewart. Whoever it was probably wanted to be anonymous for obvious reasons. I want all of you to get it and read it. We will put it on the carousel.
It'll be on this afternoon.
You can also, if you Google 1910 Coup, it is out there. You can find it. It tells exactly and specifically what happened even before Mrs. Eddy passed on, what the BOD did. It will answer all of your questions, just as the Andrew Hart book, Christian Science After 1910, does, and Miley and some of these others. The alarm bell was being sounded, but people slept on. They didn't want to hear it. I'm going to devote a small part, because there's so much to talk about in the lesson as well, but part of this hour to this, because it is so important that you understand. And again, it tells you all the things. They were all in my head, because I knew I read this years ago, and also Mrs. Evans often talked about it. But this lays it out, just how the manual, most of it is the manual, and then the great litigation. What the BOD did to undermine Mrs. Eddy's science. And this is in the preface. Mrs. Eddy was deeply saddened by the necessity of providing a manual of rules for her students after having given Science and Health to the whole world. She later realized how crucially important her manual would become after she disappeared from mortal sight, for she wrote, quote, "Notwithstanding the sacrilegious moth of time, eternity awaits our church manual, which will stand when ministries aggressive and active have passed to rest," end quote. Mrs. Eddy also realized that the directors of the Mother Church were conspiring to break her manual, for they importuned her to rescind its bylaws, the estoppel stoppers. This was because the estoppels required that the organization, not any churches, dissolve at her decease, and the directors would feel that they had been demoted. She always replied to their plea by saying God dictated her manual and that it was spiritually inspired equally with Science and Health, and therefore she could not rescind it. Under the publications of this document, the members of the Mother Church and many other Christian scientists were unaware that the current manual is a fake. It is not Mrs. Eddy's. And then she writes, this author, the writer saw that the 1910 coup had been inflicting the biblically promised plagues upon the whole world ever since the coup occurred. She saw that these plagues are cited in the Bible in its closing verses in Revelation 22, and that the penalties would continue to escalate under the regime of the hoax manual, which the directors had fabricated in secret while Mrs. Eddy was still here, and which they sold as hers within 3 weeks after her funeral. The reason the world's plagues would continue to increase is chillingly simple. It is because the director's spurious manual not only conceals the great leader's divine guidance for the whole world, but it flies in the face of those Bible verses which tell the inexorable plagues that would result from adding to and taking from the words of the sacred scriptures. Now, we here as scientists today and followers of Mrs. Eddy's pure science understand that she, as she said herself, she was a scribe under orders. What she wrote in Science and Health and the manual and also prose works, they all had 3 distinct purposes. But the manual was very important, and she is saying here that they pleaded with her before she passed on that that they would change it, that they would stop the estoppel clauses, that she would take care of it, and she refused, because here she is saying that, what is she saying?
It was dictated by God. It was written by God. She can't rescind what God has given her.
So, even before she passed on, they were at work doing it. And January 1911, all of the manuals were secretly, the 89th changed, were secretly put into the reading rooms without any fanfare, without telling anybody. Most of the general population did not even know it was done.
When Mrs. Eddy was here, every change that she made to the manual was announced in the Sentinel and the explanation for it, so that everybody would understand why the manual was changed. This change had no announcements anywhere. It was just secretly changed by the board and surreptitiously put into the reading rooms with no announcement whatsoever.
So this deceit continued, and because of it, and he parallels, or whoever wrote this, parallels it. You know, when Mrs. Eddy was around, that the tyrant Napoleon had died. The United States Civil War was well over. There was a surplus of more than 46,000 in the U.S. Treasury, and taxation was considered so immoral that taxes were always refunded as soon as any tax-related emergency was over. But then, when Mrs. Eddy passed on, the day the tax horror was born in the state of Wisconsin, she says, we had the 1913, the federal income tax law was enacted under the 16th Amendment. The Federal Reserve System was born. The World Bank, this one world order that's been talked about. The Balkan Wars exploded into the First World War of 1914. The financial crash in 1929, World War II, Korean War, Cold War, alcohol and drugs, runaway population, noise and garbage, pornography, unchecked crime, violated ecology, and perpetual hot wars.
Fires and floods.
Fires, floods. This is the plagues that were predicted in the Bible if the Word of God was added to or taken from. And we here know that what Mrs. Eddy wrote was the Word of God, as was her manual. So you see the importance of this. This isn't just about our little church here or the decline of the Christian Science movement. This is about nation and world issues. Now, this writer goes on to say that immediately after the board of directors did this deceitful thing, the relationship with the press changed. Up until that time, at her funeral, the eulogies given, she was known to be one of the greatest women on earth. The Boston Globe, you can go back and look, was just full of praises, and not just the Boston Globe.
Every newspaper in the whole world, in the free world, praised her, eulogized her, respected, even if they didn't agree with Christian Science, they respected who she was and what she stood for and what she gave to the world. When she left, the Boston Board of Directors stopped that policy. They came up with the Committee on Publication, which immediately took a different attitude toward the press, correcting the press, being antagonistic to the press. So the press stopped writing articles about Christian Science, because they were always getting them thrown back in their face by the COP.
And you must understand, and this is clearly in this article, it is clearly stated the changes made, because many people ask you the changes made in the manual. There weren't a lot of them. It was very easily done, so people would notice it. But what it did, it put all power to the board of directors, all power. So Mrs. Eddy's intent was the organization was to dissolve, not churches. It wouldn't have touched the churches. The churches could have survived and lived, and they would have. But under the dictatorship, the priesthood of the 5 board of directors, you can see what's happening. So it makes it extremely clear, and also it's very carefully researched, so there's no question about this.
And there were only 3 pages changed in the manual. At the beginning, they took out her title as Pastor Emeritus. And in the back, where it says what the manual governs, they added the words, and branch churches in 2 places, so as to give the board of directors control over branch churches, as well as the church in Boston, which is what was intended.
So one of the first effects was this about the press. And then one of the second was that all of these very important early works, they claimed control of. And even, for instance, like used bookstores, the used bookstores began to know, well, if they sold these books, for instance, like the 88th Manual, to the organization, they'd get a lot more money than if they sold it to the common person. So more and more people were sending their books, sending everything to the I call it the organization. And these rare books were getting rare to find. And he or she in this article, the Rare Book Company. That was in Freehold, New Jersey. It was who we did business with, where we got our books from. He published the 88th Manual, a man named Giraldi. And when he passed on, his nephew took over. And we dealt with them for years. And then I don't know what happened. Maybe someone that's listening does, but they closed up. And as far as I know, their books went to David Keaston,
who's the son of the fellow who ran Equus Foundation, which had a similar purpose, was to preserve the writings that are legitimate Christian Science, which are, quote, unauthorized by the organization.
And those terms were also put in the book, unauthorized, or this literature is authorized by the First Church of Christ Scientists, Boston, Massachusetts. Those words were added. All these subtle changes so they could get total control. And so they did. And then this all led to the great litigation, which we've also talked about. But where she had it, she scholars, lawyers who have studied Mrs. Eddy's original manual, the 88th, say it was brilliantly done. And it was, because God wrote it. It was infallible. It was brilliant. The 89th makes you think there was something the matter with her because it's contradictory. It undermines her. To anyone who studies it, they can't understand it, which is, again, another attempt of the board of directors to undermine Mrs. Eddy. So we had the great litigation, and some on the board of trustees, rather than confront the BOD, who was looking for total power, said, peace, peace, but there is no peace. Eustace stood up. And the first, they won under John Evans User. But the second, they lost. And so the plot thickens and thickens.
But it's so clear that when Mrs. Eddy established the church, and she was so happy about the branch churches expanding, independent branch churches, she thought of the extension of the mother church as another branch church, having its own manual and having its own board of directors. So she established the Publishing Society as an independent society to carry on the publications of the books, the Monitor, and the Journal, the Sentinel, under the direction of really good, solid, practicing Christian scientists. That they would be independent so that they could carry on the publication. However, the human mind had a different plot in mind and operated through the board of directors to change all that. So now we have a publishing society that is controlled by the board of directors. And we have branch churches around the world controlled by board of directors. Contrary to what God intended, and that is why they are going down the drain, pure and simple. So we're here not to preserve an organization, but we're here to practice a science. God's science.
This is so much more than a religion. This is a science. It is a science that anyone could practice anywhere, and many people do. And it can't be contained within an organization. And you see, it's the human mind that bollocks all this up. And even, I'm curious, and maybe someone can find this out, who was on the board of directors at 1910, and also at the great litigation. We know Annie Knox. Some of these people who were considered great scientists, early workers, got bollocksed up by all this. And I'm not sure about Adam Dickey, too. So, anyway, and it was a very, very hot time. It was like another crucifixion of the pure science that Christ Jesus has given us, which got bollocksed up by the Roman Catholic Church shortly after Christ Jesus ascended. So here we stand, and according to this article, she says there are many, independents, probably more independents than in the church, and that they are reading good literature and holding seminars and other things. And I trust that to be true, that the truth goes on. It cannot be contained. As far as I know, we're the only church. Maybe now's the time that more will come. I feel it almost. Some people think there's no need for church because we have the internet. We don't need church anymore. Maybe not. God knows.
But there's a benefit to being together regularly.
Well, I think the book of Hebrews is really clear about that we do not forsake assembling yourselves together and encouraging one another, lest any of you be deceived, be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin.
Yeah, because
the whole idea of accountability, you can't have it on the internet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And that is a great point.
And that leads us to our lesson.
And Mrs. Evans used to say regularly, one stick you can break, a bundle you can't. And that's why we have a church. Thank you.
There is this accountability here that's wonderful. Now, so I urge you all to study this, to read this. It will answer any questions that you have about what went on. We have some copies here that Jeremy made copies for us. Will be on the carousel. You can find it on the internet. I will, before we change topics, because I wonder, this has been out there, but people don't seem to know it. So Suzanne went to a church in California and talked to someone, and what they say?
Yeah, a lovely man. They had some free books there. I said, oh, I always like to see the old books, the early workers. And, I told them a little bit about the manual, changing the manual, and
we are.
And they had an old copy of Science and Health and had a picture in it. And I said, this was the original that she left to us, and he had no idea. And I told her, I said, all of this is out on the internet. It's your right to know the history of your church. And we just spoke, and he was stunned. He said, I never knew this. Telling me is new to me. He had left Christian Science for 10 years of that, and he was absolutely enthralled with knowing all of this history. And I said, you're right to know it. And he gave us some ways to find out for himself. And he said, I'm going to look into this. But it was really neat to just gently let him know that. And he said, I just can't figure out why the church got full. And I said, well, I can help you understand that.
Perfect. Perfect. And how many more are there like that? They've just been so deceived by all of this. And who knows? I don't know where I would be if I had been in this church and it just all came upon us. And thank God it did. So thank God it did. Because here we stand in the right place as an independent church, which is what Mrs. Eddy intended. So thank God for that.
Which is what God intended.
Yeah, what God...
If you want to know the board of directive members that at the time, it's in Doris Greco's The Forever Leader on page 581.
Okay, thank you.
Who were they?
They were Archibald McClellan,
Right.
John V. Didmore, Allison D. Stewart, Adam H. Dickey, and James A. Neal.
Wow.
There you go.
And this article says the one behind it, the most the one that was most behind it was the first name, Archibald McClellan. He was the one. And Mrs. Eddy knew, because he was trying to convince her to change the estoppel clauses. She knew about him. And I guess there were some fearsome rebukes toward him. But eventually, it would seem he'd gotten his way. And you see, interesting about Adam Dickey.
Yeah. And in fact, in the article, it says that Archibald McClellan added a footnote to an article in the Sentinel without asking Mrs. Eddy that she did not approve of shortly before she passed on. So she fired Archibald McClellan from the board. And before it was announced, she reinstated him. But she knew all this was going on. She saw it clearly.
And also someone else who saw it clearly was Augusta Stetson. Augusta Stetson knew. And this is why...
that's why they tried to... They literally tried to murder her.
And, you know, Royce has been speaking on this for a while. And Royce also says, I guess there is a lawsuit against the organization. But according to Royce, and it's about the manual, but it's not going to change the estoppel clauses. And that is the basic problem, the estoppel clauses. That's the thing that has to be changed. I don't know if that's God's plan for that to happen, so be it. Maybe that is. In the meantime, we keep our work up and keep knowing, and we can know this false organization will destroy itself because it's not of God, and it has to. What else can it do? And it is doing that. In the meantime, there's vultures flying around the billions of dollars that they're worth and all the real estate, and they're vultures.
But in the meantime, we know that God's true church is a spiritual organization, if you want to call it an organization.
And nothing can interrupt our textbook, you know, the fact we got to watch last night, that it is transforming the universe, and the manual goes forth. You see, and with this is correlated to what's going on in our country, with a great big government taking over everything, taking over individual rights, changing our Constitution. All these things are a correlation. So we keep working and knowing, and in that work, it will have great effect.
What did you mean by saying that the estoppel clauses have to change?
They have to be obeyed.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Because that was the point I was going to make, was the fact that even if they didn't change the manual, they simply aren't following it, because I was told I needed to, how important the manual was. I had to read it when I first came into science, so I read it, and it was like, oh, well, this board can't be around because Mrs. Eddy isn't here to approve all the changes and the board members, etc. And I didn't know the part about the teachers, but I learned that here. And then I went back and said, but how can this be? And I was given this answer that, well, we still need to do this, but that's not following what Mrs. Eddy said. You know, so I quit reading the manual because I was I didn't know how to digest that information.
Exactly.
I was too stupid to realize that I knew what I was reading.
Right. No, and exactly. That's right. No, that's exactly true. How can you explain this manual? It doesn't make sense, and it would seem like Mrs. Eddy didn't make sense. And in this article, it will tell you that where this guy said that she had made a loving mistake when she put in the estoppel clauses, and that it needed the intelligence of the BOD to correct that. So that is how foul this is.
And they won't talk about it because they don't want to bring out her loving mistake.
Yes,
feel about it.
Yes. They're so
intelligent.
Go ahead. They just put everybody to sleep so they don't. Just like, you know, with Mike, when you do question, you get told, oh, you know, that's not it. You're wrong. So I want Bruce to read the responsive reading, please.
From Revelation. And I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse. And he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness doth he judge and make war. His eyes were as a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns. And he had a name written that no man knew but he himself. And he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood. And his name is called the Word of God. And the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. And out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. And he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords.
I love that. It gives me chills.
Very powerful.
Powerful. Powerful. And this is what I found in this church. It wasn't this nice, mushy stuff, do-goody stuff. There was a power about it. And it did rebuke error. And it wasn't afraid to. Did you want to comment on that, Shardy? You wrote about it.
I was also I love this. This is the Christ, and you cannot deny the Christ, and it's very clear. And I just chose a few things from Kratzer that I picked out. It was too long. It was the whole thing. May I read what I... Okay. This is from Revelation, Kratzer, page 359. Quote, and there disclosed to me the eternal mental realm, the Christ upborn by pure ideas. His standards are right, and with right does he make war against evil, and smites the evil which has attached itself to the nations of men. He relentlessly excludes evil from harmony, and his appearance is the manifestation of life. Christ is manifest as King of Kings and Lord of Lords.
Thank you. Thank you. I love that. He relentlessly excludes evil from harmony. That's the point of a rebuke. Now, rebukes have gotten a bad name. Why?
People don't like them.
Yes. Why?
And it's not done out of love.
Yes. If you're part of, I wrote some of the definitions of rebuke on the forum. To chide, to reprove, to heal, to restrain, to calm. But it also is an expression of sharp disapproval, criticism. And if you leave it, and if you talk that way, and you're just out of hate, rebuking, and in anger, just because you're mad at a person, well, that gives it a bad name.
That's a bad rebuke.
That's a bad rebuke, because there is no
love behind it.
That's it.
Likely not to have any effect, lasting effect.
Absolutely not.
And it goes back to what Mrs. Eddy says about taking offense, doesn't it? Right? If I'm offended because I'm personally offended, and I rebuke someone for personally offending me, I have started a war, and I'm at fault for starting the darn war, or at least engaging in the war.
There's a really wonderful verse in Ephesians 4:15 that encapsulates what we're saying here. But speaking the truth in love, we may grow up into him in all things, which is the head, even Christ.
Yes,
speaking the truth in love.
In love.
That's the key. You have to have both. You have to have the truth, and you have to love God. God seems to do a really good job doing both. And I think we tend to err often on one side or the other. We rebuke unlovingly. Or we feel truthful.
Very good.
What comes to mind is the rule for motives and acts. Neither animosity nor personal attachment. And it goes on that we need to rebuke.
That's first thing. First thing in the rule for motives and acts, to rebuke. Now, in the Bible, and this is in the Mother Church extension above the heads of the readers.
Engraved in stone.
From 2 Timothy, preach the word, be instant in season, out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine. Now, I was reading the differences. Reprove. One of the differences in each of these three words. Reprove means to expose the sin. You see, this sin in the organization needs exposure.
And not for just our benefit.
Definitely.
The whole world needs it to be exposed.
It does. When an error is, the first thing an error will do is go undercover and hide. That's why they hid this change in the manual. They're hiding. They're cowards. Truth is, or error is always a coward before the truth. They're all cowards, so we don't have to be afraid of it. It's only mortal mind. So, exposure. And, first, if you have a grievance with someone, you first should talk face-to-face with them. This is biblical. Then, if they continue, then you let other people know about it. So this is what we're doing, okay? We're letting other people know about it. Because
We've had our conversation directly with them.
Yes, we have. Yes, we have.
In a court of law.
Yes.
Golden rule.
And out there in person,
At
too,
their
for a little
request.
bit.
Oh, yeah, before this.
You took a lot of steps.
Yeah. Mrs. Evans went up there and talked to them, showed them what was going on. They didn't want to listen. They did not want to listen.
They had their mind made up before she even went up there.
Yes, she was already, what's the word, convicted and sentenced. Now,
They knew what they were doing, and she was trying to ruin their gravy, trying not out of maliciousness, but out of the truth of God.
Right. Absolutely. Now, rebuke we talked about a little bit, but I read where it's mentioned 30 times in the New Testament, and Jesus does all the rebuking except for one time. And you think of I made a list of all the things he rebuked that's in the Bible, and also what Mrs. Eddy says, all the things he rebuked. Animal courage, sin, error, self-righteousness, pride, mortal beliefs, rabbinical error. And then in the lesson, he rebukes demons, fever. We know he rebuked weather, quieted the winds. And he did it. He did it with the authority of God to tell the air to blank off. Excuse me. To cease and desist with the authority of God. And that's how you do it. But you have to be in that right mind in order to do it. If you're in the human mind, it's what Gary was saying. You're arguing, you're fighting, you're yelling. It's not.
Doesn't accomplish a darn thing.
No.
Yeah.
It usually just makes double down on whatever they're right.
Absolutely, it does. Double down and fight harder, fight back. So, and go ahead.
No, there's a sense of authority over the lie, and I think that's what comes through for me. It's like Jesus. This is a war, and He, the Christ, is supreme here. Don't mess around. That's the feeling I get.
Yes.
I used to think that, this is sort of like make-believe or fanciful, because we often don't encounter spiritual, or we don't know that we're encountering spiritual warfare. And I did have an incident a long time ago. I'm not going to quote it, but I rebuked a demon within a person. And the demon came out. It was this huge, sort of wind exhalation. I mean, it was like, my hair stands on it, just talking about it right now, but it's kind of I didn't really believe that, but it happened. I had to do something, and I remembered the Bible talking about this, and I just sat in this, believe it for a voice, in the name of Jesus Christ, leave this woman, and it happened. Just like You know, I mean, it was really something. I mean, I used to listen to people those stories like this, like The Exorcist. Oh, it's just poppycock, you know, just pick it all up. But it really isn't. I mean, I know you know that. But I mean, since I made a believer out of me, and I used to dismiss things like this. That happened. And there was some spiritual warfare going on that was related to my witnessing to my grandmother, who was about ready to die. And I know the devil did not want her to receive the word.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the context.
Well, and that's often it, you
Right,
know.
yeah.
And when you're standing up for the truth, the arrow would seem to not want you to do it, and there would be opposition. So now I want to get into the three temptations of Christ. The first one, what was the first one? He was hungry, right?
Right.
40 days.
40 days without eating. So he was tempted to ask God to turn the stone into bread so he could eat it.
So this sort of displays or tells you when you're in a weak state of thought, hungry, you know, other things, feeling lonesome, maybe lonely, you are more susceptible to suggestions. So that's why it's important that we take proper care of ourselves, not let ourselves get run down, tired, hungry. I mean, here the Christ is tempted in that way. Now he knew if he finagled with this thing, it would have him in his clutches. Oh, come on in, let's have a little meal together. So he was strong there, and we must be too. And we must recognize when we're feeling these emotions, loneliness, hunger, other things to come. Fatigue. Yes. Tiredness.
Or entertaining or any lingering past history that is discordant. It makes you vulnerable to when the suggestions come.
Discouragement also. Absolutely. The tool of the devil. It'll get you. So, and as we've talked about before, the Christ always combated with "it is written." This is why we study. This is why you have to submerge yourself in the Bible, in science and health, in prose works, in the manual. Know the truth so you can't be tricked. That is your compass. Otherwise, well, this might make sense. I've been up here 40 days. I'm hungry. Sure, why not? Okay, what's the next temptation?
Offered him the world.
Written.
Yes. Now this is what the BOD needed. It was, because ultimately, isn't it the power struggle? One thing that this brings out, this article, the 1910 coup, was a lot of this had to do with the hatred of woman. Remember when Mrs. Eddy was around? She didn't even have the right to vote. Gary was saying, what about...
She didn't have the right to own property. She couldn't buy the land herself on which to build the church. She had to arrange to have it purchased through a man.
Sounds like Saudi Arabia.
It does. It does. Now it does.
I mean, it seems so barbaric today.
But a lot of men didn't like that. And I'm sure Archibald McClellan probably. We call them macho men. So anyway, hatred of woman. Okay, so the power struggle. Always watch out for that. Ambition. You let God do the promoting. If you know that, if you're humble. I've been reading, and I won't go off too much on this, but it's about the biography of Ulysses S. Grant. And I am so touched by it because it has the biblical proportions to it. He was such a humble man. His father was a blowhard. This guy was humble. And the first years of his life and his marriage, he adored his wife, who happened to be a Southerner, but he adored her. They had 4 children, and he just couldn't make any money, and it was just, he was so, well, anyway, everything he did, and it wasn't that he wasn't a hard worker. He had gone to West Point. He had military experience. But up until the Civil War, he was a nobody and a nothing. But when that came, God promoted him. God promoted him. And one of the things he was definite on was slavery was wrong. And he was right about it for the right reasons. Who are we to say, because of the color of his skin, that, you know, somebody is worse or better than somebody else? He was clear, undeviating. God promoted him. And it was because of him that he, you know, we helped win the Civil War. So I thank God. Again, God does the promoting. He was totally humble. He never promoted himself, ever. He refused to do it. He just sawed wood, as Bignell Young says. He minded his own business, and he worked hard. And in doing that, God was watching over. And thank God. And yet, what did I know about him much? Oh, he was a drinker. He wasn't a very good president. Well, all of that actually is not that true. He did have a drinking problem, but that's the least of his.
But not when he was on the battlefield.
No. And he could outsmart and outwit. And why? Because he was humble, so he could hear God's voice. Okay, that one. And now the next one. The next temptation.
Throw himself. Downfall.
Yes.
Yeah. Test God.
And show off.
Show off. And Linda, what did you write?
Well, I found in the Matthew Henry, he said not to be off your watch. And then a pulpit commentary said that we shouldn't run before we're sent. You know, we should be going where God takes us. And that was a big deal for me, thinking about this all week. That, you know, all these mistakes is because we go off and do our own thing. And then the more you go off, was said to me, mentioned talking about this week, that you can't hear God as much the more you go headstrong. And all these things that happen that kind of warn us to get our attention, that we have to pay attention to, that we're off the path. And so it's really made me think a lot about, am I going where God sends me? Because
absolutely. You get the warnings. And what was the last quote from Mrs. Eddy?
Oh, that's right. Mrs. Eddy writes in Watch's Prayers and Arguments, quote, "Never act on first thoughts unless they be of good God, but watch and separate the tares from the wheat. Learn by experience and careful comparison to know whence cometh your conclusion. Try the Spirit before acting, looking over the purpose that the enemy might be trying to accomplish, and so avoid a snare." End quote.
Thank you. Wisdom in all our actions. Some of you might have heard about, there were a couple who, and I thought maybe they had some kind of CS, bogus CS background, because they were saying evil's not real, there's no evil, God is, you know, we've just conjured it up. And they left their jobs and they were going to bike through some of the most dangerous areas in the world. Okay? And what happened to them?
They got killed.
They did, by icing. Now, that is foolhardiness. That is stupidity. To go around, and this is why, again, scientists can get a bad reputation, because we say sin, disease, and death are not real. You have to prove it and understand it. You don't go around, oh, it's not real, and do some stupid thing.
I had about 10 warnings, too. 10 things happened in that before that happened. So it's quite a lesson.
It is terribly tragic, and I'm not by any means making light of it, but there's a lesson to it, and the lesson must be had. And that's because I've seen, and Mrs. Evans used to talk about it a lot, these bogus scientists who would do very stupid things because they didn't believe evil was real. Mrs. Eddy says, "I acknowledge your claims, but I denounce your power. But you used wisdom. It's got to be proven." And that was a wonderful example of, not a wonderful, a tragic and wonderful example.
Good example.
Good example.
Yes.
Yeah.
Of what Jesus was talking about here, when he wouldn't throw himself off. You don't tempt the Lord thy God. And then probably all of you have many other illustrations of that. But it's a very important point.
One thing to say sin isn't real, but this stubborn stupidity is the sin.
And thank
you do it.
Yes, that's it.
Well, and it goes back to what what Linda read that Mrs. Eddy said. You don't go anywhere or do anything unless God directs you. When you do something out of human will, you're on thin ice. When you do something because you know God directed you to do it, then you have all the power of the universe to protect you and to support you. Divine will is never wrong. Human will is always wrong.
So if God directs it, you do it, and if not, you don't. And you have to learn to have great
discipline.
Yes, great discipline in hearing God's.
And always listening.
Yes. And as I said, I'm not making light of this. It was a very tragic, terribly tragic, and I only bring this out so it won't happen to others in a foolish way. So I'm going to end, I think, today with the end of this 1910 coup. Last few paragraphs of it. Gary will read it. And I could go on and on for hours over this lesson, but we've all read it. Maybe I'll bring out some other points next week. Okay, go ahead.
Starting there. Okay. Mary Baker Eddy's 88th Church Manual in operation, not the director's 89th, is a sure peace producing document. When the directors exhort, quote, obey the manual, end quote, they mean obey their fraudulent 89th manual. Since they know this to be an impossibility, they are actually exhorting the members to continue the destruction of Mrs. Eddy's founding and are exposing themselves as the worst possible enemies of Christian Science and Mary Baker Eddy. Organized church is not Christian Science. It conceals the science of Christianity and instead is a form of fallible human priesthood. The directors have stated that Mrs. Eddy once told a resident helper, someday the manual will be acknowledged as law, by law. If she did say that, she meant, of course, her manual. However, when the directors claim, as they do, that the litigation confirmed their 89th hoax manual as fulfilling that prophecy, they say it in unvarnished contempt toward the members for accepting such an obvious lie about God and his revelator. Like mischievous little boys, full of zealous ingenuity, those 5 servitors of the Mother Church, the directors, outwitted their beloved, revered leader, who had appointed them to help her with the repugnant to her reorganization, which they foisted upon her in 1892, under threat of immunity if she refused. And see this in Carpenter's precepts. They outwitted her by killing her manual behind her back, assuming that she was unaware of it. But she wrote pointedly, as though to the whole world, quote, eternity awaits our church manual, end quote. She was saying, humanity will wait for organized church with its fallible personal priesthood to give place to the biblical requirement for voluntary individual learning about the science of being, free from obscuration by fallible human priesthood. This will be accomplished only with the understanding of genuine Christian scientists. Divine law cannot be broken. Mortals break themselves on it when they believe that they are breaking it, or when they are not even aware of doing so. Mary Baker Eddy's church manual is divine law, and it cannot be broken.
No one, nobody, no thing can outwit Mrs. Eddy. Because she was led by God. They might have thought they did, but little did they know Little did they know. So, thank you all for joining our roundtable discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.